Arguably one of the most iconic novels ever written, Bram Stoker's Dracula is a gothic tale of horror, hidden sexuality, the lust for blood, and the living dead. Although a work of pure fiction, Stoker wrote from what he knew. He weaved a myriad of truth, imagination, and popular culture to create a masterpiece that's as powerful today as it was over a century ago. Few people who have not read the novel are aware that Stoker used very real locations as the backdrop to his story, namely Whitby, London, and of course Transylvania. These locations are so clearly described, it is possible even today to walk in the footsteps of the Count. Literary detectives who have tried to decode Stoker's original novel have met with varying degrees of success. While the clues are undeniably there, the danger is an all too literal interpretation in the hope they will lead to a series of definitive locations. Stoker intended his novel first and foremost to be entertainment. He used imagination and artistic license to create a fictional world that, while based on real places, only truly existed within the pages of his novel. The story of Dracula's creation begins in earnest in late Victorian England, a time of prim respectability and solid virtues. The 1890s was also a time of scientific advances and great wealth. The British Empire was at its peak, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the very heart of that empire, London. But appearances can be deceptive. Scratch beneath the surface, and it was possible to find backstreet opium dens, inner city slums, prostitution and murder. This dark underbelly of Victorian society wasn't just limited to the lower classes. So-called polite society also had its very own particular demons and hidden fears.
Dracula can be read in a variety of ways, and many people like to see the novel as the embodiment of the fears and anxieties of late Victorian England, particularly of the 1890s. And we look at things such as repressed sexuality, some of the challenging of sexual boundaries, the Oscar Wilde trials, the resentment of immigrants coming into England and polluting pure English blood, just like Count Dracula comes in from Eastern Europe, concerns about the theory of evolution, concerns about the weakening of belief in Christianity. These were a number of cultural issues of the day. Now, I don't think Stoker sat down and said to himself, now I'm going to write a novel that does this, this, and this. But because he's a product of that environment, then I think this stuff finds its way, through osmosis maybe, into the pages of the novel, and are justifiably ways of reading the book.
Just like the era to which he belonged, Dracula's creator, Irish-born novelist Bram Stoker, also had two sides to his personality. On the surface, he was bluff and hearty, a pillar of society and good manners. But beneath the middle-class facade was an imagination that conjured up a dark story of death, sex and blood. Clearly, Stoker had one or two secrets of his own.
It's rather curious that somebody like Bram Stoker, who had been a civil servant and a theatre manager, would write a novel like Dracula. Part of the answer might lie in his childhood. When he was a young boy, he was bedridden, actually for the first 7 years of his life. And during that time, his mother used to read to him stories of folk tales from Ireland. And she also used to tell him these dreadful stories about life in Sligo, where she had grown up, during a cholera epidemic, and the carting off of the bodies and all this gruesome detail. And I think Stoker's imagination might have been kindled very early to write this kind of fiction.
In December 1876, Bram spent an evening at the Theatre Royal in Dublin, an evening that led to a series of events that were eventually to change his life forever. The performance was Hamlet, with Henry Irving in the title role. After reading the glowing review Stoker wrote for the Dublin Evening Mail, the actor was so impressed with Bram's praise, he invited him to dinner the very next evening. The two men became immediate friends, and their association continued until 1878, when Irving invited Bram to become his business partner and manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London's West End.
His relationship with Henry Irving was a friendship. They used to sit up after performances and talk for hours. But, as Ellen Terry said, Henry Irving lay low and said nothing, and preferred to do everything through Stoker. So all the letters, all the meeting and greeting and glad handing and publicising were all done through Stoker, where Henry Irving concentrated on his art. There may have been a feeling that Stoker's energies were being used by Irving, and Irving was getting the glory, whereas Stoker was doing most of the work.
According to Stoker's own notes for Dracula, now housed in the Rosenbach collection in Philadelphia, he had started mapping out his basic ideas for a novel about a vampire whom he initially called Count Vampire on the 8th of March, 1890. These notes, now the only reliable evidence for the development of Dracula, suggest that his inspiration came from a variety of different sources. These included books, newspapers, and several places he'd visited throughout the 7 years he worked on the story.
Many Gothic writers claim to have had the origin of their novels or their stories in a dream or a nightmare. It's very Gothic, of course. And there is the story that Bram Stoker got the idea from Dracula after having had a meal of dressed crab and presumably suffering from indigestion. We don't know. Bram was known to have told that story according to one of his biographers, although the biographer makes the statement that he just enjoyed telling the story. So whether there was any truth to it or not, we don't know. I rather suspect that the ideas for novels bubble up in a variety of ways, and it takes more than dressed crab to make a Dracula. One of the pages of Bram Stoker's notes for Dracula, which were recently published, contains a list of books that he consulted, a few articles as well, but mostly books, ranging from accounts of travels to Eastern Europe, including the Carpathian region, and books about, for example, Sabine Gould's Book of Werewolves. So we know from this that he did a fair amount of research. He didn't always represent it accurately in his novel, but then he was a novelist. He wasn't a historian, he wasn't a geographer. But he did do a fair amount of research and pulled together bits and pieces from various books to work into the story of his novel. Stoker was originally going to have his count, that was when it was Count Vampire, come from Styria, which is a province in Austria, and had been the setting of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. However, he read an article in the 19th Century magazine called Transylvanian Superstitions, written by a Scottish lady named Emily Gerard, who had spent some time in Transylvania. And she noted in that article that the tradition of belief in vampires was very strong in Transylvania, and she even listed a few things such as how you destroy a vampire. You drive a stake through its heart, and the use of garlic, and cutting off its head, and so on. So Stoker probably thought that Transylvania might be a better setting. It was more remote than Styria, and it had this connection, this direct connection with vampires.
Stoker himself never actually visited Transylvania, but he does acknowledge the contribution Gerard's article makes in his notes. Because of this one document, the association between the region and vampires is, today, common knowledge. While reading it, Stoker also came across the word Nosferatu, which Gerard claimed was a Romanian word for vampire. Now, contrary to popular belief, this was not true, but due to this mistake, today Nosferatu is synonymous with vampires, not least because it was also the title of F.W. Manu's 1922 masterpiece, the first ever film based on Stoker's novel. Apart from the modern word adopted in the last few years, there is no word for vampire in Romanian. What they do have are traditional folklore vampires called strigoi. Throughout many countries in Eastern Europe, the tradition of creatures rising from their graves to prey upon the living have persisted for hundreds of years, but they only reached Western Europe in the 18th century.
In the 1740s, Dom Augustin Calmet, writing a treatise on supernatural apparitions, noted that there was something quite new. Vampires. He'd never come across them before. He said in his day it was all witches. But now, coming from places like Hungary, there were reports of men who rose from their graves and preyed on their relations, strangling them, drinking their blood, and they could only be stopped by being staked or having their heads cut off. I get the impression that Calmet did not believe in these vampires for one moment, but he did repeat some of the stories about them, including the one about Arnold Paul, who had come back to his native village claiming to have met a vampire in Turkey. He saved himself from the vampire's attentions by finding its grave and eating some of the soil from the grave, but apparently it didn't work. He fell off a hay cart and died, and a few weeks later he was preying on the villagers, who duly dug him up, drove a stake through his bloated, blood-spurting, shrieking body. But 5 years later, more vampires came back.
I think it is probable that most people in Eastern Europe no longer believe in vampires, but certainly there are some places where they do. In Romanian, strigoi is a word which originally came from Latin and was applied to the kind of witch who flies about at night in the form of a bird, sucking the blood of infants. But it's getting to be more and more applied also to vampire figures. In other words, essentially a dead body which comes out of its grave to attack the living. The best way of defending yourself against a strigoi, according to many authorities, is to have garlic round the house, at the window, at the chimney, anywhere where he might get in. And also, of course, religious symbols, because we have to remember all this is taking place within a Christian context, so the hanging of crucifixes and holy pictures would also be protective. The Romanians know of at least 3 ways of killing a strigoi. One is to stake it, another is to decapitate it, and a third is to cut out the heart. Staking has an interesting reason. They believe that a strigoi has got 2 hearts, an ordinary human one and a magical one which keeps it alive in the grave, and that by staking they will pierce the magical heart and thereby kill it. Decapitation and cutting the heart out, the ordinary human heart that is, are also much used.